Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, host of Life Along the Merrimack. We do a weekly podcast where we talk about the health and the history of the Merrimack River. I have some wonderful slides about the river. You can see a beautiful one right here. And each week I try to talk a little about what's happening on the river. I'm a former journalist. I was with the Daily News for 5 years until recently. I've been with the Boston Herald, the Portland Press Herald. So it's my instinct to go to meetings, to talk to important people as it relates to the river. This morning, I talked to Senator Diana DiZoglio. She is the state senator for Newburyport, Amesbury, Salisbury, Methuen, Lawrence, and many of those areas. And she is also really one of the leading advocates of the river. Through her, they were able to start the Merrimack River Commission, and they are trying to find money to clean up the Merrimack. So anyway, I spoke to her today. Number one, she said that a plan is almost finished to be able to create an app for your online application if there's effluent released upstream, you'll get an email, or you can go to the website of the commission and find out how much effluent it is and when it may get to your community. Now, what I'm talking about are CSOs. They're combined sewage discharges. And so that happens when there's a big rain. The rain is collected in the sewage pipes, and then it goes into the sewage treatment plant. And so if you have a lot of rainwater and you have a lot of effluent, the plant can't hold all of this liquid and it discharges it. And so this has been a big problem for the last 10 years at least of effluent coming down the river. And because of climate change in the past couple of years, we've had heavy storms which overflowed a certain sewage treatment plants in Manchester, New Hampshire, Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill. So she said we're getting close to a place and a time when they'll have a website, and perhaps they'll have emails to subscribers that'll say, there was a discharge in Lowell last night. You can be concerned for the next couple days. Don't swim in the river. Don't let your dog roam around in the river. You can still boat, you can still fish. But I think it's going to be a useful application. So that was one of the things, and I'll talk about a couple other elements of the conversation. I also talked to State Representative Jim Kelcourse, and I'll get to him in a moment because we have his photo right here, and he actually grew up on the river. His father owned the marina in Amesbury. He worked there since he was a teenager. So I had a couple of great interviews recently. When we talk about the Merrimack River, it's 117 miles long. It starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. And here you can see it coming south. It turns in Lowell, Massachusetts, where the Route 3 is on your screen, and goes northeast. So it's 117 miles. It has had a very historic history, and we will talk about that as we move along. One element that's extremely interesting for me, because I'm a historian, an amateur historian, but nevertheless, is Newburyport, being on the river, was a tremendous shipbuilding community. It was the largest in the colonies for some time. And I get that from Samuel Eliot Morison, who was one of the great historians of the 20th century. And he said there was no bigger. And one reason was we got a lot of lumber that flowed down from New Hampshire. And so unlike other places like, say, Portsmouth or Salem, they didn't have a river that went way upstream. We had 117 miles to the Merrimack, so we could get lumber. But look at how majestic these tall ships were. They're larger than many of the buildings, and they went around the world. They went to San Francisco, to Honolulu, to Calcutta, to Hong Kong. This was a community that was very cosmopolitan, had a lot of wealth in it as a result of these many trips in this trade. The golden era of trade in Newburyport was about 1790 to about 1811. The revolution stopped in 1787, so men could come back, the ships were available. Also, there were no wars going on, so that was a good thing. I say it kind of ended in 1811. The Great Fire in Newburyport occurred in 1811. It burnt down half of the downtown, which was wooden buildings. And, once they got it underway, local officials went to the state and said, can you help us out with rebuilding? And state officials said, we will help, but you've got to rebuild with brick, not wood. And so that's why we have a beautiful brick downtown today, thanks, if you can call it that, to the Great Fire of 1811. Here's a wonderful shot of building as it really was. And this is in about 1893. It was one of the Symington. It was one of the last of the tall ships. The harbor here in Newburyport, the mouth of the harbor is very shallow. And as ships got larger, they could get out of the harbor at high tide, but they couldn't get back in when they were heavy with cargo. So this is one of the last of the big ones. And you can see what a big event it was. In the foreground, many of the women had dressed up to come down to the event. Children were let out of school. And you can see how large, I'm still awed by how large this vessel was, because the people look so small. And yet it was one of the last ones to be built here. When we talk about the river after, say, 1811, which was, the end of our golden era at Newburyport, life changed upriver. And that's because hydropower was able to collect the energy of the falls. This is the Pawtucket Falls in Lowell. People realized that it had great energy. The engineers at the time were kind of like Silicon Valley. They were brilliant. They were coming up with new solutions. And because they were able to catch the falls and the power of the falls, mills started rising on the Merrimack in about 1820. In the Merrimack Valley, many communities had mills after things got started. This is a Spigot River in Lawrence. You can see the number of very large mills. You can also see the rail line to the lower right. And so coarse cotton would come up from the south by rail. It would be spun into cotton and wool here in Lawrence and Lowell and Haverhill, Manchester, and then it would be sent into the marketplace, sometimes to England, sometimes overseas. But New England and the Merrimack Valley was among the busiest areas in the world in terms of making textiles in the 19th century. The mill clock was a central element to most communities. Here's one in Lawrence. It's still there, by the way. And at one time it was the second largest in the world, next to Big Ben in London. So there's a lot to be proud of along the Merrimack. These are mills that existed in Lawrence, and it was helpful for mill workers. Not only did it tell the time, but it indicated how close they were to the shift starting. Most mill workers did not have pocket watches, and it was very helpful. If you're walking along or spending time in the park, you could see what time it is. Manchester, New Hampshire was also a very large mill community on the Merrimack. Here is a rather dramatic photo, 1936, and it shows the Merrimack River at very high water, creating very great damage. And this flood of 1936 was not only indigenous to the Merrimack, but there was flooding in many parts of the area. The Connecticut River flooded, the Androscoggin, the Kennebec in Maine, the Saco River. So you can see the force of the Merrimack. Usually it's quite placid, but when this one got going, it was quite a significant event. Again, here is the area where the Merrimack meets the Atlantic. I point this out because it's a wonderful shot that shows the sandbar to the south side of the river opening. And there's been a sandbar for a very long time. And pilots 2 centuries ago had to be aware of it. In recent years, the harbor master here in Newburyport, Paul Hogg, if he's on the radio with someone new coming in, he'll say, stay along the North Jetty because we have a very dangerous sandbar right there. So this is one of the greatest shots showing a sandbar. And each year, numerous newcomers get hung up on that because they weren't aware of it or their boat drew a little more water. Now, the river draws about 16 feet at low tide on the north side. So that means most pleasure boats can get in, but many boats watch the tides closely. Anyone would rather come in at high tide, but it's at low tide at 16 feet, you'll generally get through without any problems. The Coast Guard has long been a fixture here on the Merrimack. Here are a couple of vessels down near the Merrimack Coast Guard station. At that station, Merrimack, there are about 26 coasties there. They don't sleep there, although they can. They have apartments around town, and they're available for rescues, also for environmental endeavors. If there's a spill along New England coast, they'll go down for it. Just a week or two ago, there was a huge fire right at one of the gas stations, if I can call it that, on the river. The Coast Guard and the harbor master went out and put out the fire. So this is a quiet day in the Merrimack, although quite different from what we just saw in Manchester. And we do hear that the Merrimack is getting dirtier, not cleaner. In fact, 4 years ago, a national organization called it one of the 10 most endangered rivers in the country because we're getting more pollution. There was more development upstream, and there were several factories emitting mercury and other chemicals that are very hard to dissolve and stay in the water for a very long time. But my point here, it's a very beautiful place, even now. And here's a shot from Amesbury. Several boats are there. Maudsley State Park is behind it, and it's a fine place to keep a boat. Here again is Maudsley State Park, about 500 acres. The state got hold of it in 1986. It had been a private estate of one of the wealthiest families in New England. And I believe that, the city officials and state officials did a very good thing when they got Maudsley. So you can see it here across the river. Haverhill is, of course, upriver a little bit, but they have had a comeback in recent years. They are using the river as one of the lead assets, and you can see some of the buildings going up. There's a bank building, there's a big apartment complex. On the right, there's a building that will host part of the University of Massachusetts Lowell. So people are taking advantage of the river, and Haverhill is making a comeback. It used to make a lot of shoes, it made textiles, and it has a good diversity now. It used to have Bradford College also, that left in about 2001. So it looks like UMass Lowell is making a big footprint here, and it's a beautiful area of the river. The National Park Service in Lowell is one of the most elaborate in the country. In 1978, a federal government made Lowell a national historic spot where people can study history, they can study how the textile machines worked, and it can also study how the engineers at that time made locks and dams and canals so that people and industry could all use it at the same time. You might remember me saying that there was a lot of lumber coming down the Merrimack. Well, once the mills got there, started in the 1820s in Lowell and the 1840s in Lawrence, these big dams made it very difficult for the lumber to get down. So the engineers made canals, they made locks, and so not only did the small vessels have a chance to get up and down the river and not have to go over the falls, which no vessel does, but the large timber could also go in these canals. And so people downstream still got the lumber. But I've been to the National Park Service station here, and if you ever get a chance and want to learn more about the river or the community, that's a good thing to do. It is not open at the moment because of the virus, but you can see they put a good effort into making it a good time for all. The Merrimack River starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. That's above Concord. And here is fast water near the start of the waterway. A group from this area last year got into canoes near Franklin and came all the way down the river. They were called the Voyagers. And you can see they were in kayaks, and you had to be pretty skillful because there's a lot of white water there, and it's beautiful up towards this area. I mean, there are wonderful areas in the southern part of the river, but when you go north of Manchester and Concord, you'll find many stretches like this, which looks like it did 100 or 200 years ago. In Nashua, New Hampshire, the Nashua River meets with the Merrimack River. And here's a spot where they're actually meeting. This is in Nashua. This is not easily found. In fact, I was stumbling through a parking lot of an assisted living area. I wasn't checking in, don't worry. And I said to one of the fellows who was sitting in a lawn chair, I said, from my map, it looks like the Nashua River meets the Merrimack somewhere around here. And he said, well, you're correct. You go through that little woods over there to the left, go down the hill, and you'll be able to see it. So he seemed fairly honest. I seemed somewhat energetic that day. So I started a little walk through the woods, went down onto a promontory and took this photo. But here's where the Nashua merges with the Merrimack. The Merrimack River, as we've ascertained by this time, has many different facets to it. And here's one of the greatest falls on the Merrimack, which is in Manchester, New Hampshire. You can see the power works above it. And curiously, or maybe not curiously, the Merrimack still provides electric power to thousands of homes in the Merrimack Valley. It's not just a thing of the past. Dozens of small energy stations like this one still exist, and they depend on the power. Also, the Merrimack River provides drinking water for close to 500,000 people. And that includes Lawrence, Andover, North Andover, and parts of other communities. So when we talk about the need to have clean water and a clean river, part of the reason is because people drink the water. Now, it should be pointed out that there are scientific ways of treating the water and there are no problems. But in 1890s, a lot of young people in Lawrence were getting typhoid fever. Now, these families of the youngsters lived near the river. They drank the water from the river. Of course, even then it was, quote, purified, but the science was not that advanced and kids were getting typhoid fever. The wealthy people lived far from the river and they had their own wells, but some of the mill families were drinking the water, so the kids got sick. So the state of Massachusetts created a commission which was set to study the Merrimack River water and make some assessments about what was happening. So a handful of very, incredible engineers and chemists from MIT and other places came up. They ascertained that the water was being cleaned, but not adequately. So they actually created a new way, a new method of cleaning the water so it was drinkable in a much better form. And that method was actually replicated in many other communities. So among the reasons why the Merrimack is incredible, and that would include it's the birthplace of the Coast Guard, it's the start of the textile industry and the Industrial Revolution, one of the early cradles of organized labor. It is also the site of some of the science that created clean water in this country, clean drinking water in this country, and in other places in the world. And of course, you can imagine how important that is. Here we are in Lowell. UMass Lowell has really resurrected itself in the past 30 or 40 years. There's a dorm to the right of your camera, of the image. And you can see how much work has been done over the years. There are dams, there are locks, there are hydropower stations. There is low tide, which I believe we're seeing right now. Not low tide, but a low flow of water. So this is something that I'd never seen. It's taken from one of the bridges in Lowell. But every week I'm going out and taking more photos. And the reason I do is I'm writing a book titled Merrimack, the Resilient River. And so I'll have many of these kind of photos, hopefully showing people what they don't normally see. The Merrimack is still an area of interest for fishermen. State conservation leaders are working to clean the river so that fish can thrive again. But a lot of folks still fish in the river. And in some areas, there were signs, don't eat the fish at this point. Although the state itself says the river, you can take a boat on it, you can fish in it. I talked to the mayor of Haverhill recently, and he said, no one actually eats the fish these days. They release them, or it's a sketchy thing to eat the fish. Nevertheless, this was a quiet day, and we have a number of people jogging. There were parents walking their children, and here we have some folks doing some fishing. Lowell, of course, has many canyons and much cement work, and I've always thought it'd be interesting to write a book about the brick making industry from that era. So much of Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, Manchester, New Hampshire, it's brick. So if the textile industry was lively, the brick making industry must have been pretty vibrant also. They actually have in Lowell what's called a canyon tour. Not now, of course, because of the virus, but it is a situation where you can get a pamphlet and you can walk from one lock to another. It's really interesting. They have 5.5 miles of connecting canals and locks and streams and rivers. So this was a river that had much engineering done to it in its day. Manchester, New Hampshire, we saw what it looked like in 1936 during a flood. We saw the falls, and here's a wonderful photo from across the Merrimack. On the right, you can see some of the old mills. On the left, you can see some of the new building, including hotels, banks, office parks, and that type of thing. Manchester has made a significant recovery, and this is a shot that shows both the new and the old. One of the exciting elements of last summer was a trip by state officials, educators, and people who wanted to bring attention to the river, and we have to work hard to make it clean, that type of thing. Here's State Rep Jim Kelcourse in the foreground. He was leading. At this point, it wasn't a race, but there were 12 to 15 voyagers. They call themselves the voyagers, so 12 to 15 every day. Not each paddler, I should say kayaker, not each kayaker did all 4 days. But Jim was one of the ones who did, and so was Senator DiZoglio. And Jim, I talked to him this morning also, yesterday, my fault. And he was probably the closest to the river than any person that I've met. His father had a marina right on the river in Amesbury, and he worked in the marina as a youngster He did a lot of fishing. He did, a lot of getting people's boats ready. And so when they announced the Voyagers, Jim was ready to go. And he did all 4 days. He's probably the biggest guy. And they sometimes say that kayaks aren't large enough for some people, but Jim is about 6'3". He weighs 260. He played football at Villanova, and he fits into this kayak. But he's, an energetic guy. He went the whole way. And, he just said, so much of my life and my memories are built around the Merrimack. We had the marina. I did boating. I did fishing. He didn't do much swimming in it. I asked him specifically, well, did you swim in the Merrimack? And he said, when I was a kid, I might have, but my father was always around. And he said, no way, you're not going into that river. They also had the Powell River in Amesbury. And he said, you'll go to a lake or I'll take you somewhere, but please do not go swimming in the river. It's quite dirty in those days. Here's another image of the Voyagers. This is in Lowell. I know it says Lawrence on that sign up there. In fact, I asked the photographer, I said, your information indicates this is Lowell, but the sign says Lawrence. And he said, well, I know where I was, and it was in Lowell. But you can see some of the, close to a dozen were here. It was time consuming. It was exhausting. In fact, it rained several times, and they had the CSOs, combined sewage overflows, that they were concerned about. None of them say that they actually saw a lot of effluent or bad sewage going down, but they did. They were notified that there'd been a CSO upstream, and so they did pull out for a couple hours, I believe. So they would go to a beach, or it rained a couple times, so they went to a hotel, and they'd be back the next day. 4 days of it. Here is Newburyport Harbor, the beautiful place. I live in Newburyport, so I see it quite often. They have 1,500 vessels are registered each year, and so a lot of people come here to boat, just enjoy the weekend. Here's an area involved with fishing. We don't have many fishing boats left. This is Newburyport also. The fish have semi-disappeared. The fishermen have also. They're still very cranky at the federal government, but there it is. We're coming to the end of this presentation. I just wanted to mention a couple people who helped clean up the river. One is Senator Ed Muskie of Maine. He sponsored the Clean Water Act of 1972. There were huge grants and billions of dollars, not just for the Merrimack, but for, the Hudson, the Cuyahoga, the Kennebec. He was a real hard worker, and he got that done. He ran for vice president in 1968, was not successful, but he went back to work and was able to pass the bill, the Clean Water Act, in 1972. And everyone I've spoken to said that was the difference. Before 72, you did not want to get near the river. After that, you can swim and boat. Paul Tsongas was another great local legislator. He helped with that. He helped the river in many ways and put Lowell on the map. His family here, his wife, Nikki, she also was a congresswoman. She was a congresswoman after he passed away. Here is his resting place in Lowell. It's near the Merrimack. And so we're coming to an end, but I just, enjoyed being here, as I always do. We'll be here next week. Here is the Whittier Bridge. It was put up in the last few years, and it links New England tourists and natives alike. It helps us get around. So thank you very much. We'll be back next week. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I am Dyke Hendrickson, and please join us again. We will talk about the health and history of the Merrimack. Thank you.